Open.
I need to go get my charger. I'll be right back.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Elaiser German, first-year PhD student here in the Department of Childhood Studies at Rutgers-Camden, and I am thrilled to welcome you to tonight's conversation, Centering Black Childhood, Scholars, Activists, and Community in Conversation. We do come together in a time of grief and I believe hope. Again, justice, liberation, and abolition are part of our conversations. But what does this mean for Black childhoods? I'm so grateful we have this time together to think about the everyday lives and futures of Black children, as well as how we build the world they deserve. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank all of the organizers of the Childhood Studies Speaker Series. This series emerged out of the Childhood Studies Racial Justice Initiative, a collaboration between graduate students and faculty in our Department of Childhood Studies. One of the Childhood Studies Racial Justice Initiative core aims is to challenge the whiteness of childhood studies. And so we hold space and conversation for scholars and activists who center Black children's ways of knowing, playing, dreaming, and loving. We see these gatherings as an opportunity to build community and launch ongoing working groups in racial justice scholarship and practice. Finally, I want to thank the Rutgers University Equity and Inclusion Office, whose Idea Innovation Camden Grant supports this event. I also want to let you know about one upcoming event, March 31st, Honest Conversations, an Anti-Racist Pedagogy Workshop. And for tonight, we do expect some time at the end for Q&A. So please post your questions in the chat or write stack to unmute and share out. I also encourage you to use reaction buttons, muted snaps, or claps for full-bodied engagement. And so let's begin. It's my honor to introduce our speakers tonight. I am humbled to learn from each of you tonight, and thank you for helping us to launch this series. Dr. Kamika Royal is an urban education expert with more than 20 years of experience. Her work focuses on the intersection of race, politics, history, and urban school reform. An associate professor of urban education at Loyola University, where she helped launch the School of Education's urban education minor and led the Center for Innovation in Urban Education. Under her leadership, the center's externally facing work was aimed towards anti-racist, anti-oppressive education in partnership with urban schools and community organizations. The internally facing work was devoted to challenging the colorblind racist ideology that permeates traditional pre-service preparation and in-service educator programs. Her debut forthcoming book, Not for Us, Black Educators and and Public School Reform in Philadelphia is available for pre-order now and will be released in May of 2022 from Harvard Education Press. Gayleen Gordon is currently pursuing her doctoral degree at the Childhood Studies Department here at Rutgers University. Gayleen has co-authored Surviving All the Way to College, Pathways Out of One of America's Most Crime-Ridden Cities in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. Her interests include female delinquency, risk and resilience of vulnerable youth, recidivism, race and ethnicity, marginalized communities, and Black girlhood at the intersection of the school to prison pipeline. Gayleen is dedicated to bringing the praxis of victim awareness, bias awareness, transformative justice, and trauma-informed care to schools and the juvenile justice system. Shakir King is an activist, educator, archivist, and West Philadelphia native. She has been an organizer for the last 10 years with organizations like Black Lives Matter Philly and Sankofa Community Empowerment. Her organizing focuses on youth, LGBTQIA issues, education disparities, and mass incarceration. She also founded a mutual aid fund that distributed over $30,000 to Philadelphians in need from June of 2020 to March of 2022. Currently, she is a program manager, having previously worked for the No Name Book Club and the IA for the People, and is also working on her archiving project which highlights the impact and history of Black queer folks in Philadelphia's culture and history, as well as a reading list curated specifically for Black children called The Young Bulls. Shakira's hope is that by doing this work, she can aid in the liberation of all Black people and create equity and space for the most marginalized of us. So, how's it going, everybody?
It's going well. Thank you for asking. How are you?
I'm doing well. Super honored. Wore my best shirt for y'all, ready for this conversation. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so I think I'm first up. So thinking about Black childhood is a very interesting question or supposition for me, because my research does not focus on children. My research doesn't focus on students. I am a firm believer that any problem or issue that a child has or people see with a child, there's usually an adult attached to it when you get to the root of it. So my work focuses on adults because I think very often children, they come to us in these very distinct sort of ways, but they also are constantly responding to the environments we create and maintain for them. I will start with my own experience as a Black child. I know, shocker, I'm a Black lady who was once a little Black girl in Southwest Philly. So I'm the younger of two daughters, born to two people who are still married after 53 years. It's a whole miracle, but they still are married and still piddling around now in Delaware. My father is one of 17 children, and which presents something interesting for your childhood when you get to go see your family in North Carolina once a year and listen to stories about them pulling tobacco, and you meet cousins every year. I'm still meeting cousins that I've never met, and their children and their children's children. My mother arrived in Philadelphia in 1961 when she was 13 years old. She attended Leeds Junior High School, and then after that, Germantown High School. Germantown is one of the schools that was closed in 2013 with the 23 other schools, or with 23 other schools. She had her experiences as a child in the school district of Philadelphia. Back then in the 60s, they did a lot of tracking in their classes. And so she was put in these, what they call commercial academic tracks, and told that she wasn't college material. And so she kind of took that on the chin and tried to figure out ways to make do with that. But when it came to my sister and me, she wanted something different, and she wanted a different sort of preparation. And the first thing I learned about our experiences with school was that when my older sister was in first grade in the school district of Philadelphia in our neighborhood public school. My mother was concerned about why her reading wasn't developing in the ways that she expected. And the principal actually chastised my mother and told her she didn't have the credentials to question the school on her development. And so with that, my mother took my sister out of that school and put us in suburban school in the suburbs, in what I like to call an allegedly Christian school in the suburbs. And so we were two Black girls in Delaware County at a very conservative, allegedly Christian school where my sister was, and I don't use this word lightly, but she was terrorized. She was dark-skinned, she was chubby, she had a hard time at school. And there were a lot of things that she had to deal with as a result of that. So as a first grader, I very much remember when she was in the 5th grade and her teacher told my parents that she was the worst child in the school, only to find out at the end of the year that was the same message that was given to the parents of every Black child in the school. We both went to our neighborhood public school for middle school, she went to Overbrook, I went to Central for high school. But there are these ways that being Black girls, you become a target. You kind of get an extra eye. You're looked at and constantly told to watch how you speak to people, to mind your manners, not to entice anybody, right? So you can't be too slick at the mouth. You also have to be very particular with how you dress. There are these ways that we were constantly sort of guarded and under a state of constant correction. All these years later, as an educator, when I think about working with my students, I try to debunk for them because I teach in a place where I have mostly white students who mostly were educated. I would say half were educated in Catholic schools. The other half were in suburban public schools. And so the only things they know about childhood is one, their own childhood experiences, but then also what they've seen on TV. And so when you're talking about an othering, right, you're talking about Black childhood, especially Black girlhood, there are some very distinct things that our students don't necessarily learn before they get there. And so when we start talking about things like classroom management, they hear a lot of tough love. And so I'm always asking, when do our children, why does tough love have to be the only type of love our children seem to get? Why is it always love that's yelling? Why is the love always correction? Where is the love that is affirming? Where is the love that is gentle? Where is the love that is sort of holding them up and cheering them on? Why does the love always have to be so harsh? There are so many ways that I feel like I've learned about the brilliance of Black children. This is my 23rd year as an educator, and I'm not a parent, but in addition to being an educator, this is my 22nd year as an auntie. I smile because I think of my 22-year-old nephew who's right now in London on spring break with people from his university. And one of my first forays into, not as a teacher, but in a personal way, how Black children are examined was when he was in first grade in North Carolina. And I was visiting from Philadelphia, and his mother, who is also an educator, said, his teacher is calling him, is saying that he's having a hard time focusing. Now, he was 6, he was in the first grade, right? Do we really expect 6-year-olds to be the most disciplined? Like, are they supposed to be walking around with little briefcases and their agenda for the day and ticking off, items? And so I go to his school and observed in his class, and his teacher was very nice, but she looked at me and was like, he's a bit of a space cadet. And I was like, that's not how we're gonna have this conversation, ma'am, because I know that you recognize that I'm an educator, but, I fight people who talk crazy about my baby. And he's showing me this story he wrote, and she was like, it doesn't make sense. And I was like, ma'am, If it doesn't make sense, it's because you can't follow his brilliance, but I'm gonna need you to catch up and stop trying to put him in this box. And where is my baby now, 22 years old, walking around London, right, with his classmates? I'm very proud of him. But there are all these ways that we get interrogated as small children, expecting us to be adults, expecting us not to, not even having the grace of just being children, of sort of tumbling in this wonderment. And so part of my journey as a researcher, as an educator, is to bring that to my students. Because I'm concerned, I don't want to see my students become what my nephew's teacher was when he was in the first grade. And she didn't mean any harm, right? But she was causing harm. She was creating it. He didn't need to hear this narrative of him being a space cadet, because his way of thinking was less linear, right? And a bit more sort of abstract. There are lots of books that I like to go to. So there was a time when I was teaching, I want to say, philosophical foundations of education. And I'm a literature person, so I know it kind of made my students kind of like, why are we doing this? But I had them reading Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, because there's a lot to be learned about not just the sanctity, but the intellectualism of childhood if you read The Bluest Eye and you listen to the narratives of Claudia and Frida and how they interpret sort of the world, what they see, what they perceive as going on, how they're processing information. I had them read Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon to look at how Milkman develops his ideology from childhood to adulthood. When all these people are sort of sitting around saying, how did he get to be this spoiled brat? Well, how do you not be a spoiled brat when your daddy has all those keys and you have these two older sisters whose whole job in life is to protect you from anything, not only that feels hard, but that feels like work, to protect you from sweat. My goal is always to, with my own students, to make sure they are at least considering childhoods that may not be like their own, to make the invisible partially visible, at least, to have them think about what does it mean for someone who comes from a very different experience. So now that we've talked about this thing, what does it mean for someone who might come from a different type of family? What does it mean for a young person? I came from a two-person household. What might this look like for a household that's being raised by his aunt or his uncle or her grandma? What might it look like for a young person who has been adopted into a family, right? How might this experience be different? And how do you need to think about that as you approach your students in this particular situation? I'm gonna stop there and go ahead and turn it over to Shakira.
Thank you for the setup. Thank you, you all, for having me. As you can see, I rep Philly hard. I am a Joan through and through. I'll be a Joan till I die. Currently a Joanin in Chicago, here in the Windy City, but honored to be talking to you all this evening. A couple of things stood out to me about what Dr. Royo just said, particularly about her experience going to school in Philadelphia, because a number of years later, my experience was just about the same. So, single mother, worked her tail off, but I ended up going to Catholic school most of my life. My early childhood education was in Catholic school. And if you're familiar with Philadelphia, I went to St. Francis de Sales, which is still located at 47th and Springfield. And then I went to St. Clemens Irenaeus as a child, which is now defunct, when the diocese decided that they were going to close a bunch of schools, because school closures didn't just affect public school students at the time, right? The diocese also at the same time decided to close a bunch of schools. But my mom worked her tail off so that I could go to Catholic school. Went to Catholic school, got a lot of the same messaging. Oh, Shakira is a problem child. Shakira's just not getting it. She loves to talk. She's too much of a social butterfly, et cetera, et cetera. When in reality, the material wasn't engaging. I wasn't challenged enough, right? So nobody bothered to say to me, maybe we need to give her something else, right? Maybe we need to push her a little further. So I remember, particularly when I got called a problem child, my mom came to school the next day. It was a first year teacher. I was in the 5th grade. White guy. He messed up. He knew he messed up immediately when he saw my mama's face. And my mother I was in my classroom. She bypassed the office, came straight to my classroom and said, "You," and pointed at my teacher and said, "You, I need to speak to you now." And then after disrupting my class and pulling him down to the office, then did she get the principal involved, right? She didn't wait. And a lot of times, I'm very thankful that my mother was able to advocate for me in that way, but I also recognize that my mother was privileged in a way to have a village and a work environment that supported her when her child needed that type of intervention in schools, right? Because what we know is not a lot of work, especially for Black mothers, not a lot of work environments, not a lot of village. So you gotta take it, the phone calls on a train where you can, when you can. Didn't have much trouble with that teacher after that, but ended up, once I got to high school, I went to a Christian academy downtown. It's now called the City School. But went there for a year, and my entire freshman class got labeled as problem children, right? I don't know if it's the faith thing. I don't know if it's white educators in Black cities, but this constant labeling of Black children who you don't have the cultural competency to teach, labeling them as problem children, it's not it, right? I'm gonna say that to all the folks that are students that have hopes to go into K-12 that are in this Zoom right now. And I remember our class got accused of actually causing physical harm to someone. And they tried to like have an intervention with us, but we ended up flipping it on them and saying like, you don't know us as students. This is why you came to that conclusion. If you would have known who walks with who lives in what part of the city, which way they travel, you would have understood that none of us were nowhere near this incident that happened. So after we banded together, we all decided as a class to take this issue to our home, take them home. So our parents had to come down like all on the same day. Like we ended up organizing to get the school to recognize that we, in fact, were not the problem. Needless to say, I had got a scholarship that year. Because I was the problem child, they decided they did not want to renew my scholarship. Lost the funding for me to get an education. At the time, where Philadelphia had just closed, as Dr. Royal said, 30 schools that year.
Which year?
That was 2007.
Oh, 2007. So the 30 came in as a result of 2011 and 2013. But 2007, there were a spate of closures as well leading up to that.
So all of the schools that my mother could have potentially thought about sending me were not an option. They were too far. They were outside my neighborhood. I had gone to private school. I had no idea how to navigate a public school environment. And she was very much concerned about me having to navigate that environment. So what did we do? We picked up and we moved to North Carolina. But the bias didn't stop because I moved to a different state. In fact, it got even worse. I was in a new state. My folks are also from North Carolina. So although I was happy to be surrounded by my family and reconnect to my roots in that way, I had to adjust for being a city kid then, right? Which affected, the way that students interacted with me and teachers interacted with me and what did you learn? And I actually had a teacher ask me how many fights I had been in. And I was like, I went to Catholic school, lady. What are you talking? I wore a uniform. What are you talking about? But these kinds of things weren't taken into account because the leadership nor the teachers bothered to get to know me. So all of this, my personal experience, informs my work with young people. Young people have been my passion probably since I was in high school. I was like a mini camp counselor and watched kids and babysat. Like I've always had a passion for folks under me. And then as I started to organize, I learned about the principle of Sankofa. And I was like, oh, this is great. This is me. I'm definitely going back to get my people. Like this is it. So that's kind of what started my love and growth for this particular kind of work. And now with my archiving project, I recognize that a lot of the books that I read as a kid are not in curriculum now. So Mildred Taylor's Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. I read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry in like a day when I was a kid. I wasn't even supposed to take the book home and I took it home. I got in trouble. And I have it here. This is my favorite. And the People Could Fly, right? Which is all about Black folk tales and Black folks magic and has some slave narrative, which has been interesting to me because now we see a lot of people say, I will say Gen Z particularly say, oh, well, I don't feel the need to learn about slavery. When in reality, my understanding of slave narratives as a kid helped frame America for me as an adult. And trying to get them now to understand that slavery is not a dirty word, it's a dirty act. You were not a slave, your folks were enslaved. And so many things that you do today go back to what happened in enslavement. And it's important for you to make that connection so that you can carry it on. So that's what my work is rooted in. That's what I am rooted in. That's currently what I'm doing right now. That's where I'm from. And I'm going to pass it to Gayleen.
Thank you so much, Shamika. I appreciate that. So the first thing I will say is thank you to the Department of Childhood Studies for creating this speaker series on behalf of the countless Black children who are denied and need advocacy and support. Thank you to our host for moderating this event. I also want to thank my esteemed panelists. I was so excited to know that I was going to be presenting this or speaking with Dr. Royal and Shamika. Their dedication, their work, you know, everything they're going to use at some point, everything that they do, they're going to use at some point for reform and community empowerment. And lastly, I want to thank the audience that is there. And I really appreciate you coming out to an event that highlights the needs of Black children. So to explain what centering Black children means to me, I have to provide a little bit of my backstory as well, which is one of the most hilarious things that we all say, well, let me tell you what was going on before so I can explain to you where I am right now. So when, I'll say it this way, my path in criminology was interrupted when I began to question how we view and engage with Black youth in the juvenile justice system. I wasn't comfortable with the themes and the conclusions that surrounded Black youth. I also was perplexed by the use of the term resilient youth. I realize that that's a linchpin that we use a lot in criminology, but what kept pointing out to me was why are we rewarding or, you know, clapping for these youths because they are so resilient when we're not changing the environments that they live in, where they have to employ survival strategies in order to be resilient. So I also noted that within the folds of the juvenile system, we meet children at their place of folly or at their indiscretion, at that place of you know, getting in trouble, for lack of better terms. And when we meet them there, we have no idea about their character. We have no idea about what home life they have, what they've been through, or what even led them to commit this act. When I looked at that, I knew that that was really detrimental to Black youth. I knew that to automatically market them as resilient without trying to fix the things that they must be resilient about was not the best use of my work within criminology. So for me, centering Black youth is contingent upon recalibrating our views of criminality and criminology. Criminality is a human element and not a subpopulation designation, especially a vulnerable population. So it means highlighting the adultification of Black youth. We've spoken about that already tonight. The adultification of Black youth is a social norm instead of treating it as a social ill. We have to understand that Black children are responsible and accountable to the stereotypes that Black men and that Black women have to deal with. So for the example that Dr. Royale was speaking of, for the little girl who's dark skinned and chubby, you know, that goes back to the stereotype of the mammy. I was dark skinned, chubby when I was younger, and I always felt like I was helping. I was very much a leader. However, to a teacher who was experiencing implicit bias and all of these stereotypes that follow our community, it was looked at as being overbearing or not being a good girl. So we need to figure out a way for Black children to actually experience childhood, to be granted clemency for their youthful mistakes. And also we have to disrupt the school to prison pipeline and deliver our children from, you know, the carceral state. Now, what that centers on for me in order to mitigate that harm is educating others, especially in the school environment where they're subjected to teachers and administrative bias, and, you know, it's steeped in implicit bias. And they have, as Shamika said earlier, a distinct lack of cultural competency. It means that even now, when I teach a class in violent crime, I avoid the low-hanging fruit of Black youth in gangs and focus on true offender typologies. I help them to analyze what true criminality is instead of scapegoating Black youth. It means that when I sit down with law enforcement, I teach them how to interact with Black youth. For instance, if I'm sitting, and I've used this example with a lot of police officers, I explain to them that when you sit down with that youth and the first thing you get upset about is that they won't meet your eye, you have to understand that in a lot of communities of color, not meeting the eye is actually a sign of respect. It is a sign that they are going to kind of take their licking and you know, kind of keep on ticking. And I've seen that in various cultures, as I said, you know, Hispanic youth, Asian youth, Black youth. And when they understand that and they can just say, hey, I'm not trying to, you know, do anything to you, look me in the eye, let's talk about it, tell me what's going on. Every last one of them who tried that said that they felt that the youth responded positively to that. Also, what we have to look at is that the toll that the denial of childhood to Black youth, the toll that it takes on them is a trauma that lasts until they probably, I would dare to say lasts until they are no longer on this earth. The children are perfectly aware that they are looked at strangely. They might not know the terms we know, adultification, labeling theory, different things like that, but they do know that they are experiencing a level of hypercriminalization that no one is coming to their rescue with. And to close my portion, I'll point out one of the groups that I work with. And in this group, I deal with young ladies. Some of them are up to 18, they're in high school. Some are as young as, you know, 17. I have some 12, 13-year-olds. And the best way to describe how a youth will react when they're in an environment of trust where you are trying to help them blossom is by this example. We were taking them to upstate New York for a pool party that is hosted every year. And I'm standing by the van and I'm watching one of the young ladies come down the street. And as she's coming down the street, I see her social armor. You know, she's not really smiling. She's looking around. She's paying attention to what's around her. But the minute she looks up and sees our group, she softens. And when she met my eyes, she broke into this huge smile, ran and hugged me. I was like, oh, Miss Kayleen, because when she walked over there, when we deal with these girls, they're allowed to be children. I don't care if you're 17, you're still a child. And I'm going to tell you no, or I'm going to protect you if we're out. It means giving children a break to experience childhood. I will end it on that, but that's how I view centering Black children through criminology and education.
Thank you so much for that. It was really interesting to see the kinds of threads in between both the personal stories, but the kind of scholarship and activism that each of you is working on and working towards. I heard threads along the lines of historical memory, the white gaze, school labeling, and that these things are kind of reinforcing each other within the space of the school, but also are a reflection of kind of the broader society in which Black children are growing up. And so I want to ask, I thought that it would be important to start with a question, and a kind of origin story question. Like, was there a moment, a time in which you realized that your perspective on education and community and politics had to shift? A moment where you decided that change needed to go beyond reform for Black children?
I'll start. Most definitely. I will say, and it's weird for me to really center my own experience because I absolutely positively hate it. Like, I hate being the center of attention at any given point in time, contrary to popular belief. But I was in college, and I had, all throughout school, people had told me that because I wasn't good at one subject, that I was never going to get into college. So I might as well not even try. So I wasn't good at math. Like, to this day, I still hate math. Like, I can do it, but I hate it. It gives me anxiety. I'm working through it with my therapist right now. Like, it's a serious hump for me to get over. And so I went to community college, and I was doing pretty good. I was doing well. I had made the dean's list there, and I was on track to go to Temple in the spring. Everything was fine. And then my cousin was murdered by the Philadelphia Police Department. And I had tried my best to like recenter myself and get back on track, and I just couldn't do it. And I've had a series of stops and starts since that moment, education wise. And I was like, but I'm smart. Like, I just had this realization in my kitchen like a month and a half ago. I'm smart. I know what I'm doing. Who is the degree for? Who am I proving myself to? It was then when I realized that we absolutely positively had to reframe the way that we talk to Black children about their education and the way that they retain information, right? Because I mean, still the thought of going back to school still hangs over my head now, but I very much still have done some pretty awesome things and been in some amazing rooms and have been able to touch some of the greatest minds of our time, just being good at what I did, taking my life experience and translating it into workplaces. We also don't allow it for enough grace. It helped me realize. Like, I experienced a traumatic event, not just like I heard it on the news, the cop, like, I was the last person to see my loved one alive, and 10 minutes later, he was gone. And I had no idea until the next day when the homicide cop showed up to my door, and he had died that night. So there's that. And there was no room from my office, the institution itself, to support me, to say, okay, like, here's what you need to do to come back. It was just like, girl, we need our money. Is you coming or no? You not? Get out of here. And it was like, well, dag. We don't set students up on any level. And now, particularly in Philadelphia, we're seeing an astronomical level of violence in high school age students. My brother had lost 2 of his peers before he graduated in 2020. They had a memorial for the kids at their graduation. We don't make room for the trauma that kids are experiencing on this level. We expect them to be able to pick it up and move on, but it's unrealistic for us as adults to do it. And it's definitely unrealistic for them as children to do it. So part of the reason I really have just like been focused on even getting kids to pick up books and read leisurely has been like, okay, maybe there's something in the book that you can relate to, and then that can start a conversation about what you're experiencing in your life at this moment. So, yeah.
I can go next. I think this is such an interesting question. 16 years ago, 16, 17 years ago, I was a charter high school administrator in Washington, D.C. And to be perfectly blunt, I hated it. I was working in a high school, and that's where I realized I enjoyed middle school better. But also, I came to realize it wasn't the children's fault, right? High schoolers are in this interesting position where people like to treat them like they're adults, and they like to see themselves as adults. So traditional ways of schooling don't always work for high school, for teenagers who see themselves, they're looking to have this autonomy, right? While they don't necessarily have the self-control and emotional regulation that we would expect adults to have. But part of what concerned me while I was at my school as an administrator, my second year, was that we were, things were happening. We were having these rapid responses, right? And this would have been the time when Shakira was in high school. But so these very sort of fast responses, and I just felt like, I don't know that we're making the right decisions. We're suspending kids, we're punishing them, for this, for that. And I just didn't feel like we had enough information or enough time to think about the costs and benefits of the decisions we were making. And some of those decisions were truly life or death. We definitely lost some students along the way. Not that I think it was the fault of the school, but you exist in a context, right? And so if we set a rule that says you can't come in here out of uniform and you can't come back until a parent brings you back, but your parent isn't able to bring you back, then we notice it's been 3 weeks and you ain't been back. And so the question becomes, what you've been doing for these last 3 weeks? In what ways are we complicit that we've set up a situation where you no longer have somewhere to go? And it was just it was overwhelming for me. I was like, I don't feel comfortable being here making these rapid fire decisions for our young people without having a chance to sort of think about the implications of those things. The other thing I realized as an administrator, when I like that, not just that I don't need to be an administrator, was that I didn't want to be the police. And I realized that being a school administrator was being the police, and not just for the children, but for the faculty. And that in these contexts, people want to set up an enemy. The enemy is going to be the person who's always telling you, go to class. Where's your books, right? And so in a lot of ways, I became the enemy to the teachers too. And so I don't want to be in that position. How are we going to operate as a community where we're all working together for the betterment of our young people? How can we invite our young people to be a part of that conversation when we're not sort of on the same page, when the administrators are seen as one group, the teachers are seen as one group, the students are another group. The teachers want to get the students on their side, so they make the administrators the enemy, when we're not sort of working in concert, right, for the uplift and development of our young people. At that point, quite honestly, I tried to leave education altogether. I quit that job and I didn't have another one lined up because I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I know what I'm not going to do. Another year is come work in another one of these schools. Like, it felt like prison to me. Right. And the students, I remember calling us the feds. Like, I'm doing hall sweeps and trying to get people out the hall. I was like, this can't be my life. I wasn't even 30 years old. I think I was 27, 28. I was like, this can't be. This is not why God made me. This cannot be what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life. And so at that point, I was like, there has to be something else. I didn't know what it was. I just knew what it wasn't at that time. And so since then, I feel like my career has been this series of things unfolding in these very beautiful ways, but ways I didn't necessarily expect. But it has allowed me to then push for something different when it comes to Black and brown young people that I could not have pushed for had I stayed in a traditional, K-12 setting as an educator.
So for me, my aha moment occurred when I was recruited to bring in a program into Camden, New Jersey called Roses. And Roses functions up in New York, and it is a voluntary program for young ladies to be, to deal with advocates. They spend 6 months being trained by youth, then there's 6 months they get assigned to a person. So when I started working with this, I'm dealing with young ladies in the juvenile justice system. And if you've ever dealt with that population, they've been there, done that, seen it all. So you're not really going to impress them at all. But what really resonated with me were the unfair conditions that they found themselves in. So to Shamika's point earlier, this entire thing of what is wrong with you, what's wrong, why do you keep messing up? We see all the time that girls are given anger management. But if she's being raped at home, or if something else is going on, all the anger management classes in the world are not going. Did I say Shamika? Is Shakira so sorry? See, you know what? That's the nerves. Thank you so much for being gracious. So y'all just saw it. I can be called on the carpet and have my coattail pulled. Shakira, forgive me. Okay. That's my Philly John over there. I can't be offending her. So when we started dealing with that, I kept noticing that when we would go to these meetings with the Juvenile Justice Council, the banter centered heavily on their color. I noticed that when we started going through, when I was presenting at different conferences, they would judge criminality based upon young Black men. And it came with the frustration of being a Black woman in this environment and knowing that everyone's sitting there looking like, what do you have to say? What do you have to say? Don't look at me. But it was the frustration of, I've been a Black girl before. I know a lot of Black men. This is not the proper representation. And I will say this, for this purpose alone, I was so happy about the pandemic when it was time for me to teach again. And let me tell you why. It removed this ideology that Black youth are violent just for the sake of being violent. Did you see Karen killing someone over toilet paper in Orange County, California? So we saw what being resource strapped, the kinds of lengths people would go to get these resources. And guess what? It wasn't just an urban environment. It was all over. So it was a good way for us to juxtapose what you keep saying about, the Black population. So as my frustration grew, as my commitment to bringing the truth grew, I felt very overwhelmed. I mean, the police were built upon slave catching. I mean, come on. You're asking us to look at something like that and say within my one lifetime, a change, I'm going to do so much change. I don't know that. All I'm responsible for is doing as much as I can within this lifetime. But it really came from sitting in rooms where I felt that Black youth, Black men, and Black women were being scapegoated and wondering where their voice was. So I decided to become it within rooms such as those.
Thank you so much for that. Again, there's so many threads in these stories. And even for myself, I also worked at a charter school. That was one of my aha moments, this is not what I'm going to do, not only for myself, my spirit, but in the service of doing right by Black children. That wasn't the space for it. And also, Shakira, you mentioned this kind of fugitivity that's a part of the Black experience, running from one place to another. And I want to circle back to that, but I see in the chat this kind of theme coming up over and over again, right? That we went from understanding the school to prison pipeline to understanding the school is a jail, right? And so I want to hear from y'all how we contend with a historical memory of Black history that says that education and literacy is always for liberation, and the contemporary truth that the institutions that teach literacy are for education are a part of the carceral state. How do we contend with those two realities?
So I would start with saying we have to be clear that there's a difference between education and schooling. That education can't be just confined by the bounds of buildings, by what the state sort of creates, or a church or some religious institution or people with a couple dollars put together and say, you know, you can pay us or we may give you a little scholarship to send your children over here. That's not the bounds of education. So the first thing is we have to be clear that schooling and education are two very different things. And honestly, the more I study schooling, the more I hate it. The more schooling I feel like over time has been restricted and constricted to these very narrow ideas, but it doesn't stop education from happening. There's so many, I mean, where education can and does occur is boundless. The other thing is when you talk about education and literacy as being for liberation, I would say that there are lots of different perspectives on what liberation is, what it means, what it looks like, right? And so I think it behooves all of us to get clear what we mean when we're talking about being liberated. So when I teach students about schooling for liberation, and I'm talking to them about critical pedagogy and this sort of this idea that none of us wins until we all win, that I don't sort of aspire to have them think about competition, but cooperation, that we create environments where students support each other's academic growth so much that students are willing to take intellectual and academic risks with each other, that they don't feel like they're trying to outdo each other to shine and all this sort of thing. There are people who see liberation in very different ways. And so while I 100% agree that our sort of racial and cultural narrative has been that education is for liberation, we have to decide for ourselves what that means, because there are some who will tell you our liberation is going to come from supporting Black dollars, right? But I'm concerned about the Black capitalists, right? And you know, honestly, I don't need a more diverse set of oppressors. I'm not interested in somebody Black exploiting me either. You understand? So I think that there has to be some clarity around what we mean when we're talking about liberation. And we have to be clear that if you are relying solely on school for your education, something is truly going to be missing, because schools are not interested in educating our children for their full humanity. Okay, they are interested, and we see this with COVID, they are interested in containing children. There was a case out of the state of Michigan where these young people sued the state to say, school is compulsory, but I graduated and I'm functionally illiterate. And the state of Michigan said, while we do you have to go to school, we are not required, we are not constitutionally bound to educate you. Okay, so you can't depend on school to give our children everything they need. If you're only educated at school, you're going to be missing most of what you need.
So I'm gonna be the millennial here and definitely crack a few jokes, but also tell the truth. So you know how? So I was in the era of George Bush's No Child Left Behind. Like that was me in school during No Child, like 2008 in school, No Child Left Behind. George Bush left a number of my peers behind. Okay, like seriously left a number of us in a gap. And now us are 30-something. We're 30-somethings, upcoming in our 30-something. Some of us have children, are having children. and we can't help them because we don't have the information, right? So now we're grappling with the fact that, like, okay, I don't know this word as much as I thought I knew it. And what we're seeing, I'm going to go on a little tangent here. What we're seeing is a whole generation that is being, what we're seeing is a whole generation that is being fed misinformation and taking it as fact. There's no critical thinking skills. There are none. So we're ending up, so we can't even begin to talk about liberation because there's an adult generation who don't have the skills to think in a liberatory mindset. And as Dr. Royal just said, you can't, that can't be divorced, right? So we sat in buildings for 8 hours and didn't really learn. Sitting with that as an adult is uncomfortable. So then you double down on the fact that, well, I graduated and I got through this and I got through that and I'm here. Yeah, but a lot of that is just survival. I think part of it is going inward and looking and see where we were actually successful and where we lack. And then coming to that ground and meeting that middle ground. Because being liberated requires an intense amount of reading. I have about 50, for my project I'm working on, I have about 50 library books in here. That's the max I can draw out. I have about 50 library books in here, and I've read about 30 of them. I tell people, friends call me, what are you doing? I'm sitting on the couch reading. You always read, there's always a book. Yeah, there's always gonna be a book in my hand, y'all. What are we talking about? What are we doing? And then the other thing is the reading also has to have that historical context. Like I said earlier, a lot of people say, I don't want to learn about slavery. Why is that? What's the uncomfortable thing? Why are you uncomfortable? What is it that makes you uncomfortable learning about it? I'm sorry, our folks got here on boats. I'm sorry. It's uncomfortable. It's disgusting. It's heartbreaking. It makes you angry. But what do we know about anger in Black folks most of the time? It turns into a righteous anger, and then we get, excuse me, I'm a cuss. We get shit done. You have to be willing to recognize where you lack to get to the liberatory point. Because we don't know everything, and we're not going to know everything, and that's okay. You always have to be learning. Always. Like, Du Bois didn't become Du Bois because he just was born that way. Part of it, yes, but he did a lot of studying with a lot of minds across cultures, right? You know, Dr. Royal, she's sitting in front of her bookcase right now. I know her book list is lit. I know it's lit. We have to continue our education outside of the buildings. To the folks on the call, like, Rutgers is great. It's still an institution that's going to serve itself at the end of the day. So you always have to be dedicated to going the extra mile to bridge whatever gap Rutgers will leave you with, because they will leave you with a gap.
So for me, when I think of education as liberation, in my mind, I have to flip it and say liberation through education, simply because a lot of times when we're dealing with the youth and trying to look at what's going on with them, we're preaching to the choir, okay? So tonight, to a certain degree, those who came out and are interested, we're preaching to the choir. To me, it requires the education of those who are in positions of authority. So for an example, one of the readings I was looking at to Shakira's point was Dr. Chanye, and she speaks about how they were at this school, and this woman was dealing with these Black girls and she hated them and she got sick of dealing with them. So she decides to go off and become a policy person for school. So now you have this woman who hates Black children looking at that experience and going off to create policy that will impact these Black children. So it comes to talking to the children about it, but also going through the top down. Now, is it always going to work? No. Does it work sometimes? Yes. But we have to educate others that we come in contact with. You know, who's ever on the call. My job is to educate each person I meet. If it sticks, I'm happy. If it doesn't, the next person, all I did was plant the seed, someone else can water it. And then hopefully it will grow. But it comes to me from not only educating our children, but educating those who will deal with our children. It comes from when I decided to teach, I didn't want to teach in elementary or junior high or high school because I felt like they wouldn't let me tell the truth. They won't let me tell the truth about what has impacted Black people in this country. I have a little bit more freedom in upper education, you know, and with that freedom comes the responsibility of ensuring that those who are going to go out and become police officers, those who are going to go out and work on legislation and policy, that they can never say that they hadn't heard the other side of the coin. So that's what it looks like for me.
Thank you so much. Again, so many threads to follow in this conversation. And I really want to be able to get to all of it, but I know that we can't. And so this is a beginning of a conversation. And I wanted to follow up because I think, Dr. Royal, you brought up a great point about defining liberation, defining Black liberation specifically. And so my question is Black liberation the same for Black childhood? Can we even answer that question? And how does that question become answerable for us?
So it's an interesting, I don't know that I can answer that fully here, right? Like it's one of those questions that I think you would have to sit with, because there's layers to it. When you're talking about Black childhood, so there are a few things that come to mind. You know, I told a story about my sister having a hard time at that school, but the story I didn't tell was why I also had a hard time, but for different reasons. So she was struggling through school. I had straight A's and still was somehow a problem for the people at this school. So much so, one of my girlfriends and I joke, still my friend, she's a school counselor, has been a school counselor for, I think this is her 22nd year in Chester County in Pennsylvania. But when we were fifth graders together, our teacher pulled us into the hall to reprimand us and told us we were gang leaders. So here I am from Southwest Philly. My girlfriend was from Jersey, but she would spend a lot of time in Chester. And all that teacher really knew was that we were from Philly and Chester. So, you know, if we were questioning her, we must be gang leaders. And this is why I mention it, because I think of children questioning, Black children questioning, and how that's so often perceived as a threat, right? As something to be squelched. So I said earlier that I'm auntie. I have 3 little ones though. So my one I call my tornado, who's 7, and 2 4. I do call her, honey, she is a force of nature. Okay. She told me when she's a pandemic, you know, child. The pandemic started when she was in kindergarten. And so she was at home on Zoom and she said, I'm going to ask my teacher if she's racist. And I said, why? And she said, because I raised my hand and she doesn't call on me. And I said, okay. I said, does she call on, right. Shakira's like, I mean, she must be, sound racist to me. So I was like, well, let's explore this a little bit. I said, because you know, if you ask the people, are they racist? They usually don't say, yes, put me down, like put me in that column. So let's think this through a little bit. You know, me, this is what auntie does with the tornado. And so I said, you know, is she calling on white kids instead? And she was like, Mika, we don't have white kids. And I was like, okay. She said, she the only white person. I said, okay. So what makes you think she's racist? And she was like, she don't call on me. I'm like, all right, it could be. She the white lady, you know, your little black girl. It could be, that could be a motivator. It could also be you talk a lot and you're a tornado and she don't want to hear it, right? But here's the thing. I'm like, keep doing your investigation, sis. You have a right to inquire. Now, I don't know that if you ask her, I think it's going to put her on the defensive, you know? I'm like, but don't forget that you already have this thing you're wondering about. Because with them, I try to encourage their ability to ask. Because for so long, I feel like culturally, it's something that is seen as bad for us. One of my 4-year-old twins just got put out of pre-K. Right? And so part of the concern for her mother especially was that one twin was being constructed as the good twin, while the other one was being constructed as the problem. Now, here's how I know. I mean, she's funny. Like, she likes to slide down my steps. And so, and after I told her not to, I said, let's think through what's going to happen if your head hits the wall at the bottom of the steps, right? Because telling her not to do it is not enough reason for her to stop. And I'm not interested in punishing her. So, I mean, she's having a good time going down the steps. It's fun at Aunt Mika's house, but I needed her to think through and to walk through, because I trust her intellectually what might be the consequences of you doing this, right? And if you can live with those consequences, sis, I mean, go ahead, you can do that. I still suggest you not do it. But I think it's really important that we treat children as actual intellectual human beings. That particular 4-year-old came over here telling me about bioluminescence. And I was like, what is bioluminescence? And she was like, it's when animals light up. And she calls herself Dr. Destiny. I'm Dr. Destiny, the scientist. There's so much brilliance in our children that I feel like Black children in particular, so many of us have been socialized, and we then socialize our children to speak when spoken to, right? To stay out of adult conversations. And while I do think some of those things are necessary, I think that we have to be mindful of how we present children's thinking and thoughts to them. My thing is, you're a full human being. You have the right to ask questions. Now, I'd like us to think about how we ask those questions, because I, you know, as an elder, I don't expect to be disrespected. And so let's talk about how you can ask that question in a way where people might be receptive to that. But you have a right to ask these things. You have a right to be a free person. Now, you don't have all the rights, because as a free 7-year-old, you can't provide for yourself, and somebody is going to have to still take care of you, right? But I think it's this interesting sort of balance. I think it's a pursuit, right? And I think that we have to constantly be asking ourselves, what can I do in this situation to allow my child, or this child who I love, these children who I teach, to sort of operate as a free human being? What would that look like if I didn't punish them for non-compliance, but I allowed them to sort of think differently?
I would like to piggyback off of that, because I didn't realize it until, you know, again, therapy. I didn't realize just how much of me had been sucked out by teachers who did not like me. Let me be clear, did not like me. And here I am, 26, 27 years later, trying to put those pieces back and rebuild my confidence from something that happened to me at 6 and 7. Ridiculous, right? Ridiculous. So much of how we talk to children, particularly Black girl presenting, and let me also say this, like, we haven't even brought in the aspect of LGBTQ plus children in the way that they face discrimination at Black LGBTQ children, face discrimination at all of the intersections, right? So they it's just hammering down on them. We haven't even begun to have that conversation. I think that deserves its own day. But when you don't recognize where the people that you're teaching, because they're all people, right? Little people, medium-sized people, big people who think they're wrong, you know, when we don't recognize whatever intersection they stand at, we invalidate them and chip away at who they are. which also affects the way that they're able to pay attention in a classroom. So you may have a child who is questioning their own sexual identity. There's no space to work that out at home. Ain't no space to work that out at school. You think that they don't like you. They think that you don't like them. There's all this weird teenage. I'm thinking of teenagers because I love high schoolers, even though most people don't. I love high schoolers because they think they're grown and then they think they can go toe to toe with me. And then they forget that I'm from Philly and I grew up in Philly in the 90s. No, get out of here. But really, you grow up with this tension and then it's just like, well, what's going on? And eventually you have to have that hard conversation. But I don't think that we provide enough room for that conversation. The same way that we don't, the tornado and the other 4-year-old twin probably don't have enough room to ask the necessary questions, right? Because as soon as a child says why, what's our immediate response? I'll let everybody type it in the chat. As soon as a child says why, what is our immediate response? Especially if you're a Black or brown teacher, it's because I said so. Right. Come on here, that's right. Because I said so. I still work with kids in the afternoons now. And I recently had a young lady come up to me and she said, Miss Kira. I said, I'm in trouble. Miss Kira. Yes, darling. How come sometimes the only thing you say is because I said so? I said, because sometimes I'm lazy. And I was honest. I said, sometimes I'm lazy. And the mental gymnastics it takes to get you to understand the reasoning why I need you to do something is just, it's not time that we have, right? We're here for a certain amount of time and I need y'all to move fast. Sometimes I'm lazy. Sometimes I just don't have the energy, right? And she was like, you know what? I get it. Because sometimes I don't have it either. And I said, okay. And now we've unlocked another level of like trust and understanding. Because if I look at her and I say, Jay, I just need you to do the thing, please, because I asked you to. Like, it's also my approach. Please, because I asked you to. I just need you to do that for me right now. I know you don't want to do it. Please. I'm asking nicely, right? Like, and to some people that's like, well, why am I begging a child? That's not begging. You're not Keith Sweat. That's not begging. You are asking, communicating politely with another human being to do the thing that you need them to do. So I think part of it is also like the structural aspect of teachers, after school providers. They don't have, because a lesson plan is due, because your administration says that this has to get done in a 90-minute period and all that stuff, you don't get to build those kinds of structures where your students trust you and have the room, like Auntie Mika's babies need, to, ask the questions.
To Shakira's point, I also think that it's really important that the students know that you're there for them. When I first started working with this one group, one of the young ladies who's a firecracker cornered me. And of course, she starts with the Miss Gayleen. And what she said to me broke my heart. She goes, okay, so you've been around and you are volunteering with us, but we need to know if you're going to stay so we can know if we're safe to love you. And I paused. And even right now, I'm thinking about how I felt in that moment. And I said, well, I can't promise you that I'll always be at Rutgers, but I can promise you I'll always be in your life. But even then, they're looking for those vulnerable places. They're looking for the people to love on them. And when they say something to you like, tell me if it's safe for me to love you, because what's undergirding that? Abandonment. Because I've been abandoned so many times by people who said they were here for me. It's things like that we have to think about when we deal with our youth.
I really just love the emphasis on space to be vulnerable and then relationships, right? That if we care for the lives of Black children, then we care to show up for them, and we care to make it safe enough for them to be able to show up authentically, right? With questions. I want to get to a question in the chat. It says, how can we help support this is from Alexandra Friedman. How can we help support the Black youth in suburban schools? What are your opinions on the roles race plays in truancy, academics, discipline, etc., in primarily white schools?
In working with, in working with different school boards, I would say one of the first things you can do, one of the reasons why things take place that parents don't know about, they're not showing up for the school board meetings. And guess what? You don't have to be a mother to be there at the school board meetings. I was there all the time speaking about things that children were telling me, because in suburban communities, that's taken very seriously, what is said at school board meetings. So even if you are invested in nieces or nephews or something like that, there's power in numbers. Show up to different things like that. Let your voice be heard at events where the principals are, the superintendents are. Let your voice be heard there, because for some odd reason, the only thing that people understand would be either money being removed or people showing up, that I've seen at suburban schools.
This is an interesting one for me. So it's not that I disagree. I don't disagree about the need to be engaged with school boards. I think that's important. But I think the engagement has to happen on multiple levels. And there are concerted and strategic efforts to actually keep families from being engaged and participating in schools, in suburban schools, whether it's suburban or city schools. Something I saw around 2007 in the school district of Philadelphia, I saw in 2019 in Springfield Township. And that is parents and family not being permitted to enter the school beyond the office, under the sort of the idea that, families, it's dangerous. We don't know what families or parents will do when they enter the school. So whatever's going to happen, you can talk to the people in the office, but you can't see your child in the classroom. You can't go to the classroom and observe. You can't bring cupcakes for the class, right? So when I think about suburban schools and I'm hearing things like truancy and things like that, I'm actually thinking that before and beyond that behavior, it would behoove anyone concerned with and invested in the school to look at what precipitated that. What policies and practices were in place prior to kids not showing up that stopped their families from being involved. Because everybody who doesn't show up, they're not just showing up because they have to go to work or because they don't want to, but there have been ways that these schools have worked to alienate these families in the same ways that, as much as we appreciate medical people, as someone who spent time in a hospital this past weekend, there are ways that people start to feel like they're experts, and so families can get in the way with all their questions. So I want us to just remember that it's not just how do we help the children with those behaviors, but how do we dismantle these policies and practices that actually ban and bar families from engaging with the adults that work in these schools, so that these schools can be places that are more receptive to our children.
I don't think I have anything positive to say about suburban schools, to be completely honest, just because of my experience with them. Like, I had to move out of the city to go to it, and I went to a suburban school. It was really in the country. At Seven Springs, North Carolina is the country. School had a dirt road, just country. We had cows, country. But I don't necessarily have anything positive to say, just because suburban schools exist because of redlining. Like, Lower Merion exists because Lower Merion just did not want to be a part of Philadelphia school district. but Overbrook is right here. So if Overbrook being the wonderful, beautiful castle on the hill, what my dad and them call it. My entire father's side of the family either graduated from West Philly High or Castle on the Hill, which is Overbrook. You say the last name King and Overbrook, still they look at you a little sideways. But to know that Overbrook, what should have been my neighborhood school, and underperformed so horribly that my mother was like, I don't even want you walking past Overbrook High School. I don't even want you looking at it. But all my friends went to Overbrook High School, and in my opinion, they turned out just fine. But the idea that, like, just because Lower Merion is literally a street away and it's better, and Kobe Bryant went to Lower Merion and like, you know, I don't really have positive things to say about suburban schools, and especially their treatment of Black children, because it's usually tokenized. It's usually, oh, your kid can come out here and play a sport. We can work it out so they can play a sport. Or academically, we can work it out. But I don't really think that suburban schools are built just in their nature to actually help Black students in any way. So I'll have nothing positive to say about that. There was another part to that question though. I forgot what it was. Oh, about race and truancy. Yeah, I mean, in Philly, it's hard. I will say that if you are in the Philly surrounding area, it's hard because there are so many children who have to travel across the city. So I had kids who lived in West Philly who were going to South Philly High when I worked there. And for me to get from West Philly to South Philly was a bus, a train, a bus and 2 trains. So expecting a kid to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to travel, and we're not looking at addresses when we're looking at why at a kid's profile, or when they scan their ID to come into the school, we're not looking at the address or the full file to really understand what's going on. I also have nothing positive to say about that, because that's just policing. And, you know, I'm an abolitionist, so.
That was actually a question I want to get to. I don't know if we'll have time, but I do hear these tensions between working within systems, responding within systems, and kind of refusing those systems and going outside of them. And I hope we have time to circle back to that. But I do want to get to Desiree Thomas's question in the chat. What does Black child centering strategies and accountability look like for actions, i.e. IG teachers, judges, probation officers within respective systems that have direct contact with children and ultimately create and reinforce conditions that contribute to marginalization and oppression? So kind of getting at that same tension between, where do we situate ourselves between the discourse of abolition and the immediate fires that Dr. Royal, you kind of alluded to at the beginning of our conversation, that have to be responded to in real time?
I'll start out. I would never tell, I never tell my students. So as somebody who's been in education for 23 years, 15 of them have been higher education at this point. So when I stopped working in a high school, students had cell phones, but we didn't have social media, right? So there are so many ways social media has changed childhood that I wouldn't presume to tell people sort of how to contend with that. Here's what I will say though. When we think about how children's behaviors are interpreted, I think sometimes we even as I was listening to Gayleen use the word criminality, right? And it actually makes me think of eugenics and the idea that certain people were predisposed around criminality and pauperism. And it takes me down on this path where I know that criminality is a construction. Crime is a construction. This is social construction. We decide what is deemed a crime and what isn't, right? And so many of those things are then placed on our children. And our children very often don't get the grace to be just who they are, right? To cut up, right? There are so many ways that children doing the things that kids have been doing since the 1950s, if not before. But the technology is different. The visibility is different because the technology is different. The word gets out faster. Those things get criminalized in ways that when you add on the capitalism and the classism and the racism and the cultural oppression with that, right? They all sort of start compounding our children in this like pressure cooker system that doesn't allow them to sort of be who they are. I'll stop there and let somebody else get to this, but I do think that we have to watch the labels that we put on the behaviors of our children.
So really quickly, I definitely agree with that. But really quickly, I also kind of want to go back to something I just learned. Reading a children's book, a book made for children. Truancy was created as soon as Black people built their schools. There was no such thing as too many days that you could miss in school if you were a white child. You just made up the work. Truancy was made specifically to put young Black children on chain gangs to put them back into chattel slavery. Sit with it. It's uncomfortable. Just sit with it. So, excuse me. Again, losing my voice. I'm sorry. When Black schools became a thing, one-room schools became a thing, they started to take roll. They began to take roll. Whatever county school board said, we need to see your roll sheet. Because remember, Black schools and white schools started and ended at different times because post-Reconstruction, a number of families became sharecroppers. So you could only go to school, excuse me, you could only go to school when you weren't needed to pick the cotton for the season or plant the seed. So it was like October to March, that's when Black school operated, October to March. When they started to track how many days Black children were missing, and then remember, Black children didn't have access to buses. They had to walk. So God forbid something happened and they had to walk. Ground was too cold. They didn't have shoes. Family member got sick. They had been, let's talk about the trauma piece. They had been terrorized by the KKK or some faction of it. They had to report which childs weren't there. Turn them into the school board. School boards also were not created until Black people had their schools. So we're talking about a system that is intrinsically focused on Black children. We're talking about a way of reporting, a way of educating that is intrinsically focused on the downfall of Black children for them to fail, right? So when you talk about, when we talk about criminality, we have to go all the way back and talk about why the system was built, who built it, who said it was necessary for this thing to exist. And it always comes back to white supremacy. So when you have even Black administrators, I'm gonna just say it, when you have even Black administrators who aren't willing to reckon with that and provide grace for their Black children, because much of the circumstance still hasn't changed, unfortunately. You still have children whose parents working 3-4 jobs just to keep their lights and their bills paid. kids who are taking care of younger siblings who have to get them out the door before they can get on a bus to go to school. When you're not taking all of those things into account, when there's not a communal aspect to how you lead a school, to how you operate a school building, there's no point. So until we reckon with the fact that truancy court, truancy as a word, is only to demonize Black children, then there's no point in us even beginning to talk about how we address it racially, because it was only meant to address Black children and demonize Black children.
And just a short blurb to add to that, I absolutely love the concept of going all the way back, because one of the things I did was, before I even started on this, I was looking at history. I went through the criminal justice system so that I could affect change, because I saw that we were being eaten and no one, and in my mind, I was like, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to go from there? But the other thing that we have to realize is that all of this points back to this adultification of children, and we have to give them back the ability to be a child. We're not looking at that. Not too long ago, they filmed a little girl being arrested by a police officer. He says, stop, she's 9, stop acting like a child. Her response is, I am a child. You know, that was her response. I am a child. What do you mean, stop acting like a child? So it goes back to letting them have, you know, there's so many points that have been made, letting them have youthful indiscretions, letting them figure out themselves, letting them construct their own identity instead of one being superimposed on top of them. It goes back to recognizing, well, if we want to center childhood, we need to recognize that they're children, because our world is built in a way where it does not acknowledge it.
Thank you so much. I actually had to come on my phone because my internet connection got really bad. And we are at our time, and I think that this conversation needs to continue. But I want to ask if you all feel comfortable.
You muted.
Can you hear me? But if each of you could share one reading, right? We spoke about reading being extremely necessary for our liberation. If each of you could share a reading, an article, a book, a children's book that you recommend for all of us on our way out, that would be amazing.
It's so funny. One of the books that really impacted me when I started is actually right here, because I've been working on some things, is a book called The Price for a Pound of Their Flesh. And basically it deals with the commodification of the Black body from, you know, in utero all the way to death. And it talks about how there has been a price placed upon the Black body, a price placed upon our flesh. So when we talk about flesh, we're speaking of, you know, when you go into a supermarket, and they buy, you know, a chicken or beef or something, they're not thinking about the body that came from. They are simply flesh. So this book talks about how the flesh of Black people were viewed throughout their entire lives, and even how it was useful in death, because that's how our medical community found out so many different things that they know about the body. So that's a really good book if you want to understand how that brute beast, how the viewing them as so much flesh came about. So it's a really good book for that, the commodification of Black flesh.
So shameless plug. So like I said, the most recent project is a book project. It's a book archiving project that centers the stories of Black children, particularly, and it's called For the Young Bulls. It's mostly just a social media project right now. It's a passion project. So bear with me. I'm working on a schedule and working 3 jobs right now. So bear with me, but it's growing. Like I said, the Logan Family series, this is a vintage copy. I got it at a thrift store for like $1. But Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Great book. It's fiction, but this whole series talks about post-Reconstruction Black family and what it was like for them to live in the South during post-Reconstruction. Centers told from the lens of a young Black girl. She tells it all. This is new, not written by a Black author, but it's still great. In the Name of Emmett Till talks about how his peers, people who were the same age as he was, get written out of the story all the time about how they actually caused the adults in their lives across the South to step up for him and say his name. They were brave when a lot of the adults were not. Of course, a classic that everybody should have on a bookshelf right now, The Black Book, which is in a historical anthology about kind of put together by Toni Morrison. Just flat out your Black encyclopedia. You need it. And then this was the book that I just recently finished. It's called Tell All the Children Our Story. It literally starts with how children were involved in slavery, their role in slavery, their role in Reconstruction, their role in the 60s up into the 90s. It's great. All of these books are listed and have been listed on that Instagram page. I can share it. And yeah, these are the things that I feel like help bring a fuller picture of Black people in education.
I definitely second the Logan series. The Logan's Mildred Taylor is the author. The last book in the series she published in 2019 or 2020. And I'm looking at it right now, All the Days Past, All the Days to Come. Just a beautiful series that the friend I mentioned who I was called a gang leader with, she first introduced me to it when we were in 4th grade. She read it. I read it as an 8th grader. I taught it as a 7th grade teacher. It's just beautiful. I also would encourage you to pre-order my book, which is available May 31st. The title of it is Not Paved for Us, Black Educators and Public School Reform in Philadelphia. You can order it from your favorite bookstore. You can order from Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, but my friend Mark Lamont Hill's bookstore is Uncle Bobby's, or you could do Harriet's bookstore. You could also order it directly from Harvard Education Press, which has a 20% off coupon right now.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. It was extremely generative. And I don't know about any of the participants, but you will be getting emails from me probably tonight because there's so much more that I want to keep talking about and so many shared experiences that I really think we need to dive into and work on them together. So again, thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists, our participants, to Rutgers and the IDEA grant that was able to make this come together.